a gun so powerful that it would change the very physics of tank warfare. The war that began with laughter and German tank turrets soon turned into a desperate race against physics. British crews had seen their shells bounce off enemy armor like pebbles against iron walls. Commanders filed reports that read like obituaries for an entire generation of tanks. And somewhere in the quiet offices of Vickers-Armstrong, a small team of engineers stared at blueprints and realized they would have to rewrite the laws of battlefield survival. The plan started in May of 1941, long before most tankers even knew they were doomed. The Directorate of Artillery had already anticipated that Germany's next generation of tanks would carry armor beyond anything Britain could pierce. The answer, they believed, was a new gun, one powerful enough to punch through 130 millimeters of steel at 1,000 yards. The number sounded like fantasy, but so had radar once. So had Spitfires. The name they gave it was plain and practical: the 17-pounder. At Vickers-Armstrong, the assignment landed on the desks of designers who understood exactly what it meant. To penetrate thicker armor, velocity was everything. To achieve higher velocity, you needed more propellant and a longer barrel, and the longer the barrel, the more recoil it produced. The math was merciless. Each shot from this new gun would unleash the backward force of a double-decker bus slamming into the mounting at full speed. By late 1941, the first prototypes were ready for testing. The gun looked enormous, over 4 meters of steel, a barrel 55 calibers long. When it fired, the ground itself seemed to move. In trials at Lulworth, its armor-piercing round tore through captured German Panzer plates as if they were tinfoil. The engineers watched in silence. They'd built a monster. The ammunition itself was revolutionary. Traditional armor-piercing shells relied on brute force, solid steel slamming into armor. The 17-pounder's new design used a discarding sabot round. A lightweight aluminum casing surrounded a dense tungsten core. When fired, the sabot fell away, leaving the narrow penetrator to continue downrange at nearly 1,200 meters per second. That kind of speed turned kinetic energy into a weapon all its own. At that velocity, armor didn't just crack, it vaporized. The tests were stunning. The towed version, officially named the Ordnance QF 17-pounder, could destroy any tank in the world. The only problem was getting it to the battlefield. The gun was heavy, long, and awkward to transport. Crews struggled to conceal it, and its size made quick repositioning almost impossible. Still, it was approved for production in late 1942, and by February 1943, the first batteries reached the front lines in Tunisia. The effect was immediate. At Hunt's Gap that February, a single 17-pounder battery destroyed 5 German Tigers in one engagement, 3 of them at ranges greater than 1,500 yards. German radio chatter that night carried an edge of panic not heard since 1940. Crews who once felt invincible suddenly realized that British guns could kill them before they ever got close enough to return fire. But, for all its success, the towed version wasn't enough. The desert had proven that anti-tank guns alone couldn't hold ground or exploit breakthroughs. Britain needed that firepower inside its tanks. That's when the engineering nightmare began. The 17-pounder was simply too large for any existing British turret. The new Cromwell tank had a turret ring 54 inches across. The gun required at least 60. Retrofitting it would mean redesigning the entire hull, a process that could take more than a year. And Britain didn't have a year. Normandy was already on the horizon. Then someone looked west. The Americans had been shipping M4 Shermans to Britain through Lend-Lease, thousands of them. The Sherman's turret ring measured 69 inches, more than enough room for the monster gun. What it lacked in elegance, it made up for in space. Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge proposed what sounded like madness. Cut the Shermans open, cram the 17-pounder inside, and get them to France before D-Day. The conversion program began in January 1944 under crushing deadlines. The modifications were brutal. The radio had to be ripped from the turret and relocated to the hull. The recoil system needed to be redesigned to keep the massive gun from smashing itself to pieces. The loader's station shrank to the size of a coffin. The balance of the entire tank shifted forward, making it nose-heavy. The gun's long barrel stuck out like a spear, throwing off handling and making concealment almost impossible. But when it fired, none of that mattered. The shell left the muzzle at more than 3,900 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, it could punch through 160 millimeters of armor, enough to destroy any German tank from the front. For the first time since 1940, British tankers would meet their enemy on equal terms. The new machine received an unassuming name that hid its importance: the Sherman Firefly. By June 1944, Fireflies were rolling down the ramps of landing craft onto the beaches of Normandy. There weren't enough of them, only one per troop of 4 tanks. But they were there, their long barrels glinting like spears amid the hedgerows. Tank commanders were given strict orders: save the Fireflies for the heavy hitters. Don't waste their ammunition on trucks or bunkers. Their job was to kill tigers and panthers, and nothing else. The Germans had no idea what was coming. Their tank crews had spent years fighting British armor that posed little real threat. They were confident, even contemptuous. Veterans told new recruits the same thing: keep your front toward the British and you'll be fine. Nothing they have can touch you. That assumption died in a Normandy orchard. On June 7, 1944, a day after the landings, a troop of Shermans from the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards took up defensive positions near Tilly-sur-Seulles. Among them was a Firefly commanded by Sergeant Joe Bramall. As German tanks from Panzer Lehr Division approached through the trees, Bramall's gunner tracked a Panzer IV at 600 yards. The German commander angled his hull, confident his armor could handle whatever the British threw at him. The Firefly's 17-pounder roared once. The tungsten core hit the Panzer's glacis and tore straight through. A second later, the tank erupted, ammunition detonating in a flash of orange that lit the orchard. The next Panzer tried to reverse, but smoke filled its driver's compartment. German radio transmissions intercepted later captured their confusion. What gun did that? What kind of Sherman is that? No one had an answer. Over the following weeks, Fireflies began turning up in after-action reports across the front. At Villers-Bocage, at Hill 112, at Tilly, at every place where German armor pushed forward expecting an easy kill, they found themselves dying at ranges they thought were safe. On June 13th, during the fighting around Villers-Bocage, Sergeant Stan Lockwood's Firefly from the county of London Yeomanry caught a column of German tanks moving between stone buildings. His gunner, Trooper Joe Ekins, aimed at the lead Panzer IV and fired. The shell hit squarely, blowing the turret clean off. The second German tank tried to reverse out of the narrow street, but there was nowhere to go. Ekins fired again. The shell punched through the lower hull, igniting the fuel. Both tanks burned where they stood. Somewhere behind them, the most feared tank ace in the German army, Michael Wittmann, was maneuvering his Tiger. Hours earlier, he destroyed an entire British column, 14 tanks and 15 vehicles in less than 15 minutes. That morning, he'd been a legend. By afternoon, as his Tiger backed out of Villers-Bocage under fire from British guns that could finally reach him, that legend was starting to crack. The Firefly changed the psychological balance overnight. German crews who had once been untouchable suddenly found themselves hunted. Prisoners captured in late June spoke of panic spreading through Panzer units. Crews who'd been told British shells couldn't penetrate their armor now whispered about a new Sherman with a gun that could kill them at any range. They called it the long-barrel death. The paranoia grew fast. German tactical reports in July recorded multiple cases of crews abandoning intact tanks after spotting a Firefly barrel glinting through the hedgerows. They didn't wait to find out whether it was aimed at them. For the British, the change was intoxicating. For the first time in 4 years, they weren't prey. The men who'd watched their rounds bounce off German armor in the desert were now firing weapons that could punch through a Tiger's front plate like paper. One veteran described the feeling simply: "We finally had the hammer instead of the anvil." The effect on morale was profound. Crews no longer dreaded encounters with German armor. They looked for them. Fireflies became the backbone of every armored troop, and though they were few, they were feared. Commanders began using deception to amplify their presence, painting fake long barrels on regular Shermans to make it appear every tank was a Firefly. Even illusion became a weapon. German units, once so methodical, began hesitating. That hesitation was fatal. Panther commander, who paused for 2 seconds to confirm whether the Sherman in his sights was a Firefly, often found himself dead before he finished the thought. The balance of power had flipped. By mid-July, Reports from German divisions in Normandy read like dispatches from a collapsing empire. One battalion commander wrote bitterly that his crews had been assured by intelligence officers that British guns remained inferior. In 2 days, his unit lost 14 Panthers. Most hit frontally at ranges they believed were safe. Intelligence, he wrote, might wish to revise their assessments. In the chaos of the Bocage, those tight, green labyrinths of hedgerows and stone walls, British tankers began fighting the war they'd been waiting for. They learned to hide their Fireflies behind standard Shermans, letting the ordinary tanks draw attention, while the 17-pounders waited for a clean shot. When the Germans exposed themselves, the Fireflies struck with surgical precision. 1 shot, 1 kill, and silence returned. By late July, German orders were explicit. Destroy Fireflies first at any cost. Even if it meant exposing your flank, even if it meant ignoring all other threats. The order itself was an admission that the myth of German invincibility had died. But the transformation went deeper than tactics. For 4 years, British tank crews had lived with the knowledge that their equipment couldn't save them. Now they carried a weapon that could. The emotional weight of that shift was enormous. Men who had gone to battle expecting death began to believe in survival again. One crewman from the 23rd Hussars wrote in his diary, "For the first time I felt we were the hunters, not the hunted." Across Normandy, that feeling grew. On the Burgess Ridge during Operation Goodwood, a single 17-pounder battery destroyed 11 Panthers and a Tiger in 3 hours. The guns hit from such long range that German crews never even saw where the fire came from. Panic spread over the radio nets, German voices breaking, commanders shouting orders that made no sense. The army that had once been the model of discipline was cracking under pressure. For the British, the victory was more than physical. It was redemption, a closing of the circle that had begun with the humiliation of Dunkirk and the laughter of panzer crews in the desert. The 17-pounder had erased that laughter forever. By August, German instructors in training schools back home were forced to change their manuals. Crews were told not to rely on armor for protection. Don't assume a Sherman can't kill you, they were warned. Identify the barrel before you advance. Keep moving. Never expose your front plate. Every sentence was a reversal of everything German tankers had been taught since 1940. That kind of uncertainty is poison in war. It breeds hesitation, and hesitation kills. The psychological collapse came slowly, then all at once. Replacement crews arrived at the front with less experience and outdated tactics. They'd been trained to fight an enemy that no longer existed. The confident, aggressive Panzer arm that once stormed across Europe was reduced to cautious defense, hiding in woods and behind ridgelines, waiting for a chance that never came. The Firefly had done more than level the field. It had tilted it. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the numbers told the story. Fireflies and towed 17-pounders destroyed hundreds of German tanks, often at ranges their crews once considered impossible. British losses dropped sharply and morale soared. The myth of German superiority, the thing that had haunted Allied tankers for 4 long years, was gone. And in its place stood a new truth, that technology, courage, and relentless adaptation could turn humiliation into mastery. The gun that had begun as a desperate experiment inside a factory in Britain now ruled the battlefields of Europe. By the summer of 1944, the thunder of the 17-pounder had done more than shatter German armor. It had shattered an illusion. For years, the Wehrmacht had lived off the myth of invulnerability, a belief forged in the deserts of Africa and tempered on the plains of Russia. Now, in the hedgerows of Normandy, that myth lay burning beside the wrecks of Tigers and Panthers. The men who once mocked British guns now whispered about the long-barreled Shermans that hunted them. Inside German command posts, reports arrived daily describing catastrophic losses. Veteran crews were dying faster than replacements could reach the front. Every fresh crew that climbed into a Panther or Tiger carried not confidence but fear. They had been taught that armor equaled safety. Normandy proved otherwise. The radio traffic crackled with panic and disbelief. Captured transmissions revealed commanders shouting into their microphones, voices breaking, demanding to know where the fire was coming from. For the British, the transformation felt almost unreal. 4 years earlier, they had watched their shells ricochet harmlessly off German steel. Now they were destroying the enemy from beyond his reach. The balance of terror had reversed. British crews no longer prayed for miracles. They relied on mathematics and velocity. The gun that had begun as a desperate blueprint now defined a generation of warfare. By late July, the Germans were rewriting doctrine on the fly. Commanders told their men to avoid frontal engagements, to maneuver rather than stand and fight. They warned never to underestimate a Sherman, for any one of them might carry the deadly long gun. Those orders might have saved lives if they had been issued months earlier. But by August, it was too late. The German army that had once advanced across Europe in a tide of steel was now retreating through France in a flood of wreckage. Panthers abandoned on roadsides, tigers blown open like tin cans. Each wreck was a silent monument to a single truth: that the era of armor supremacy was ending. The impact of that realization spread far beyond the battlefield. In London, analysts studying the Normandy campaign saw the 17-pounder not merely as a weapon, but as a warning. It had exposed how quickly technology could turn victors into victims. The 2-pounder had seemed adequate in 1938. 6 years later, it was a symbol of failure. The 17-pounder was invincible in 1944, but no one dared assume it would stay that way. War was evolving too fast. American officers studying the Firefly's performance were astonished. They had dismissed the British obsession with upgunning the Sherman, confident in their own 75mm and later 76mm designs. Normandy changed their minds. Reports showed British Fireflies consistently killing tigers at over 1,000 yards. U.S. crews, armed with weaker guns, often had to flank or call for air support. The lesson was obvious. In September 1944, the U.S. Ordnance Department accelerated development of the 90mm gun that would equip the M26 Pershing. The arms race had begun in earnest. The Soviets, too, were watching. Their T-34, once the terror of the Eastern Front, was now struggling against upgraded German armor. When Soviet intelligence learned of the British 17-pounder's performance, they immediately pushed for heavier weapons of their own. Within a year, the Red Army introduced the T-34-85 and the massive IS-2 heavy tank with a 122mm cannon. Guns built on the same principle the British had proven in Normandy: strike first, strike hard, and strike from range. What began as a single British response to defeat ignited a global revolution. Every nation that studied the battlefields of 1944 drew the same conclusion. The age of relying on armor thickness was over. Firepower had become king. In Britain, that understanding shaped the design of the next generation of tanks. The Centurion, conceived during the final months of the war, was built around the 17-pounder from the start. Its turret ring measured a full 76 inches, designed specifically to house large, high-velocity guns without compromise. The engineers who had once tried to cram oversized weapons into undersized turrets refused to repeat the mistake. The Centurion would be the first British tank designed for the gun, not the other way around. When the Centurion entered service in 1945, the war was nearly over, but its philosophy would define the next half-century. It represented a new kind of logic, that a tank's worth was measured not in armor thickness but in what it could destroy. Firepower first, armor second, speed third. The formula that began with the 17-pounder became NATO doctrine for decades. Across the ruins of Germany, the lesson was equally clear to Soviet engineers. They understood that no armor could remain invulnerable forever. Instead, they sought balance and mobility, low profile, overwhelming gun caliber. The IS-3, unveiled in 1945, carried a 122mm gun, capable of killing any Western tank of its time. The world had entered a new era, the constant duel between penetration and protection. The 17-pounder stayed in service long after the war that created it ended. Fireflies fought again in Korea, their long-range accuracy proving invaluable against Chinese armor in the hills. Towed versions remained in regimental service into the 1950s, and even as guided missiles began to appear, old gunners still trusted the familiar recoil of the gun that had saved them in Normandy. Its longevity was no accident. The gun had been designed with room to grow, tolerances so precise, metallurgy so advanced, that it could fire increasingly powerful ammunition as new propellants appeared. It had been built to defeat armor that didn't yet exist, and that foresight kept it relevant for nearly 20 years. But the real legacy of the 17-pounder wasn't the steel it destroyed. It was the mindset it created. Before Normandy, tank designers believed protection could always stay one step ahead of penetration, that thicker armor and clever angles could keep crews safe. After Normandy, no one believed that anymore. The physics were too clear. Kinetic energy would always find a way through. That realization drove the next great leap in armored design. Sloped armor, composite layers, explosive reactive tiles, all attempts to cheat the math that the 17-pounder had written in fire across France. Every innovation after 1944 was in some sense an argument against that gun's dominance. Yet even as engineers searched for defenses, soldiers remembered what the weapon had done for them. For the crews who had fought in 2-pounder tanks, it wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was redemption. It was proof that Britain could adapt, could outthink, could win. The gun had restored their faith not just in their machines, but in themselves. When the war ended, many Firefly crews returned home quietly. Some stayed in the army. Others went back to factories, farms, or offices. Few ever spoke much about what they'd done. But when they gathered at reunions, they all remembered the same sound. The deep crack of the 17-pounder firing, followed by silence and the sudden knowledge that the hunter was dead. It was the sound of the world turning. Historians later called it the most effective Allied tank gun of the war. That's true in a technical sense, but to the men who fought with it, it was more than effective. It was salvation. Decades later, military theorists would trace a straight line from that British cannon to every modern main battle tank in existence. The American M1 Abrams, the German Leopard 2, the British Challenger 2, the French Leclerc, all descendants of the idea that began with the 17-pounder. That survival on the battlefield comes not from being untouchable, but from striking first with overwhelming force. The irony was that the gun itself, born from desperation, taught every army that complacency is fatal. The British had once believed the 2-pounder was enough. They paid for that belief in blood. The Germans had once believed their armor was invincible. They paid the same price. Every nation after them learned the same lesson in different ways, that no weapon stays supreme for long. By the 1950s, the 17-pounder was finally retired, replaced by new guns firing even faster, harder, farther. But the blueprint it left behind never disappeared. Inside every design office where engineers sketched new cannons, the ghost of that weapon lingered, a reminder that victory belongs to those who anticipate the next threat, not the last one. If you stand today beside a surviving Firefly, its paint faded, its barrel streaked with rust, you can still feel what it represented. The long barrel looks impossibly heavy for the small Sherman hull beneath it, yet it stands balanced, purposeful, patient. It's more than a museum piece. It's a monument to adaptation, to the men who refused to die quietly in machines that couldn't protect them, and to the engineers who gave them a weapon that could. In that narrow space between invention and extinction, the 17-pounder taught the world a hard truth. Every war begins with old weapons and ends with new ones. The armies that survive are those that learn fastest. The British learned in time, and because they did, the laughter that once echoed from German turrets in the desert never returned. The hunters became the hunted, the prey became the predator, and the sound that replaced laughter was the clean, unanswerable thunder of a British gun firing once, precisely, and changing the course of history. When Britain entered the Second World War in September 1939, its armored divisions rolled toward destiny, carrying a weapon that already belonged to another era. The standard gun mounted on nearly every British cruiser and infantry tank was the QF 2-pounder, a 40mm weapon firing a projectile that weighed barely 2 pounds. On paper, it was a reasonable choice. British military doctrine of the late 1930s valued speed, maneuverability, and precision over brute force. The belief was that future wars would be won through movement, tanks exploiting breakthroughs, racing through enemy lines and fighting fast, mobile duels where agility mattered more than heavy guns or thick armor. In 1938, after successful trials at Lulworth and Shoeburyness, the 2-pounder became the Army's standard anti-tank gun. It could penetrate 50mm of armor at moderate range, and that seemed more than enough against the light German tanks the British had observed during the Spanish Civil War. The gun had a high rate of fire, 12. rounds per minute in controlled conditions, and it was compact enough to fit inside the small turrets, favored by British designers. On paper, it looked like the perfect balance between firepower and mobility. But war doesn't happen on paper. In May 1940, British tank crews rolled into Belgium and northern France expecting to fight fast, open battles. Instead, they discovered the harsh truth about their equipment. The German Panzer III, the backbone of the Wehrmacht's armored force, was tougher than anyone in London had predicted. Early versions carried 30 millimeters of armor on the front, enough to shrug off hits beyond a few hundred yards. In the real world of battlefields, dust and chaos, those distances mattered. Engagements were happening at 800, 1,000, sometimes 1,200 yards, far beyond the range at which the British gun could do serious damage. Tank crews soon learned the sound of their own failure, the high-pitched metallic ring of shells bouncing harmlessly off German armor. It became a sound they hated, a sound that told them they were outmatched. Worse still, the 2-pounder could only fire armor-piercing rounds. British planners had never considered that a tank might need to engage infantry or fortified positions. In their view, tanks were for fighting tanks and nothing else. So the gun that was supposed to protect them couldn't fire high-explosive shells at all. When confronted by enemy soldiers or soft targets, British tankers were effectively blind and toothless. The Germans had no such limitation. Their Panzer IVs carried 75mm guns that could fire both armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition. A German tank could destroy a building, scatter infantry and dual other armor, all with the same weapon. A British tank had only one trick, and it was already outdated. By June 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was retreating toward Dunkirk. Hundreds of tanks were lost, abandoned, or burned out in the chaos. The 2-pounder's weakness was no longer theory. It was fact written in wreckage across northern France. But after the evacuation, there was no time to redesign or rearm. The army needed tanks immediately, and the factories were already tooled for the 2-pounder. The 6-pounder, a promising 57mm weapon still on the drawing board, couldn't be built fast enough. Britain went back to war with what it had, not what it needed. New models like the Matilda II, the Crusader, and the Valentine rolled off production lines in Birmingham and Newcastle, all armed with the same small gun. When those tanks reached North Africa in late 1940, their crews entered a new kind of battlefield: vast desert, endless visibility, and an enemy that had mastered the art of armored warfare. Rommel's Africa Corps arrived in February 1941, confident and battle-hardened. His Panzer III and a V tanks carried thicker armor, 50mm or more on the front. Against that, the 2-pounder was nearly useless. British gunners had to close to within 300 yards, point-blank range in desert terms, to have any chance of punching through. At those distances, German return fire was instantaneous and lethal. The equation was simple. To destroy a German tank, a British crew had to get close enough to die first. The first major confrontation came at Mersa el Brega in March 1941. British cruiser tanks, nearly all armed with 2-pounders, faced German panzers across open desert. German after-action reports tell the same story again and again. British shells striking armor with no effect. One German officer, Lieutenant Hans von Luck, recalled thinking they were being fired on by machine guns. When he learned the truth, his crew laughed. That laughter spread through the Africa Corps like wildfire. The British weapon became a joke mockingly called the little pointy gun. Behind the laughter was simple physics. The Panzer III Ausf. Common in the desert by mid-1941, carried 50mm of steel across its front. At 500 yards, a typical range for desert engagements, the British gun could theoretically penetrate 55mm, but only if the shell hit at a perfect 90-degree angle. Real tank battles rarely offered perfect angles. Even a 30-degree tilt increased the effective armor thickness to nearly 60mm, more than the 2-pounder could ever manage. The result was inevitable. British crews watched their rounds bounce off harmlessly while German shells punched clean through their own armor. By late 1941, frustration had turned to despair. Operation Crusader, launched in November, was supposed to be Britain's great counterattack. The British had twice as many tanks as the Germans, over 700 vehicles against roughly 300. Yet victory never came. At Sidi Rezeg on November 23rd, the 7th Armored Brigade lost 113 tanks in a single day. German losses were 72, and most of those were repaired and back in service within days. British tanks had to close to suicidal ranges to inflict damage, and at those ranges, the Germans destroyed them first. To German crews, the war became sport. They began calling these engagements Panzer Safari, a hunt, not a battle. When you know your enemy's gun can't harm you, you fight without fear. Confidence becomes arrogance, and arrogance becomes domination. For British tankers, the psychological damage ran deep. They fought bravely, but they knew they were climbing into machines that couldn't protect them or strike back effectively. Some crews described the feeling as volunteering for execution. They still went because duty demanded it. But every mission was a gamble they expected to lose. Captured German soldiers interviewed later said it felt unfair. It was like shooting rabbits, one gunner admitted. They kept coming even when they couldn't hurt us. By early 1942, the 2-pounder was no longer a weapon. It was a liability. Then finally the replacement arrived, the Port 6-pounder, a 57mm gun with real stopping power, began reaching front-line units in the spring of 1942. It could penetrate 70 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, enough to challenge the Panzer III and I-4 on even terms. For the first time in years, British crews had a weapon that worked. They called it a revelation. They could finally fight without driving straight into death, but their relief was short-lived. That same year, near Leningrad, German engineers unleashed a monster. Intelligence reports spoke of a new heavy tank with armor thicker than any Allied weapon could penetrate, and a gun capable of destroying anything on the battlefield. Few believed it at first. Surely no army could build something so massive, so invulnerable. Then the first Tigers appeared in Tunisia. They were real and terrifying. The Tiger I carried 100 millimeters of frontal armor and mounted an 88mm gun derived from the famous anti-aircraft cannon that had already earned a grim reputation in North Africa. Against that, the 6-pounder might as well have been throwing pebbles. In one early encounter near the Oued Rabai Valley, a Churchill tank destroyed a Tiger only by firing 7 shells into its rear deck from less than 200 yards. Anything less than point-blank range was hopeless. The lesson spread quickly. A head-on fight with a Tiger was suicide. By February 1943, British armored units across Tunisia were reporting the same grim conclusion. "We need a gun that can kill these things from the front," one report read, "or we need to stop sending tanks against them entirely." Then came the next shock. In March, intelligence confirmed that Germany was fielding a new medium tank, the Panther, with sloped frontal armor equivalent to more than 120 millimeters of protection and a high-velocity, 75mm cannon that could destroy any Allied tank before they even got close. The Tiger was terrifying but rare. The Panther would be built by the thousands. For British crews, it was a nightmare. They had barely caught up, and now they were behind again. The Germans weren't just ahead, they were accelerating away. By mid-1943, morale in British armored units had collapsed. The veterans who'd survived the desert now faced an invasion of Europe, knowing that their guns were once again inadequate. Training instructors reported that new recruits, once briefed on German tank strength, quietly asked for transfers to infantry or artillery. It wasn't cowardice. It was arithmetic. The British Army was sending men into tanks that couldn't win a fair fight. The War Office knew it too. Somewhere in the chaos of North Africa, engineers at Vickers Armstrong were already working on a secret weapon, one that would restore balance to the battlefield. It would be heavier, louder, and far deadlier than anything Britain had ever built before.